On August 18, 2026, Amanda Anisimova beat Eala 4-6, 6-4, 6-2 in the third round of the Cincinnati Open, and by the time that final set ended, Eala hadn't just lost a tennis match, she'd handed the entire tennis world the exact blueprint for the one problem standing between her and a deep US Open run. Here's the answer before anything else. She won the first set. She had the lead. She had an entire month of momentum sitting behind her. And Anisimova clawed back from a set down to close it out in 3. That's the result. But a scoreline by itself doesn't tell you why this particular loss matters more than 5 wins would have. It matters because of exactly how it unfolded and what it revealed about the one gap in her game that a Grand Slam draw is specifically built to exploit. Drop into the comments right now, before we go any further. Did Anisimova simply find something nobody else this summer found? Let's rebuild the match from the beginning, because the shape of it tells the entire story on its own. Eala took the first set 6-4, playing exactly the brand of tennis that's defined her entire month. Patient counterpunching, extended rallies, forcing Anisimova to hit one more ball than she wanted to hit. For a full set, the approach that beat Naomi Osaka, that outlasted Alina Svitolina, that ground down world number 3 Jessica Pegula through a dropped opening set in the Washington final, looked like it was working exactly the same way against a completely new opponent. And then, methodically, it stopped working. Anisimova leveled the match at 6-4 in the second set. By the third, there was no version of the plan left to lean on. 6-2, 2 games, nothing close about it. Comment below with your honest read. Is a 6-2 third set a warning sign, or is that simply what happens once a top 10 ball striker locks into her rhythm against anyone? Because the underlying numbers actually support a specific, less comfortable answer than a casual glance at the scoreline would give you. Here's what the stat sheet shows, and it's worth sitting with before jumping to conclusions. Anisimova landed 61% of her first serves to Eala's 58%. Close, not a dramatic gap on its own. But look at what happened once the ball was actually in play. Anisimova won 67% of points behind her first serve. Eala won only 58%. On second serve, Anisimova won 62%. Eala, 54%. Flip to the return numbers and the gap widens further. Anisimova won 42% of return points against Eala's first serve, compared to Eala managing just 33% against Anisimova's. On second serve returns, it was 46% to 38%. Service games won, Anisimova took 79% of hers. Eala held only 64%. Return games won. Anisimova claimed 36%. Eala managed just 21%. Those aren't small, explainable margins. Those are the numbers of a contest that started essentially even and then tilted, game by game, set by set, in one clear direction. Tell me in the comments which explanation you're picking, because both sides have real evidence behind them: fatigue, or Anisimova solving her live, mid-match, with no prior history to work from. The fatigue case writes itself if you look at the calendar. On August 3rd, Eala won the Washington, D.C. final. 48 hours later, she was in Toronto, playing through the Canadian Open bracket. From there, it was straight to Cincinnati, where she beat Elena Gabriela Rus in a match delayed by lightning before Rus retired, trailing 6-1, 3-0. That's 3 tournaments, 2 countries, minimal recovery time, stacked on top of a sponsorship rollout with Marriott Bonvoy, and a viral interview clip pulling attention from every direction off the court too. Bodies don't run on adrenaline forever, and a third set against a top 10 ball striker in August heat is exactly where that bill usually comes due. But here's the problem with leaning only on fatigue as the full explanation. Anisimova said plainly, without hedging, in her own pre-match press conference, "No, I haven't played her before. No scouting report. No prior history to build a plan from." And she still adjusted enough mid-match, in real time, to win 79% of her own service games while holding Eala to just 21% on return. Fatigue alone doesn't produce that kind of shift. An opponent actively solving a puzzle in front of a live crowd produces that kind of shift. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does more rest fix this before the US Open? Or does this require an actual tactical adjustment against exactly this style of flat, first strike hitter? Because those are two completely different problems, and only one of them gets solved by sleeping more between now and Flushing Meadows. Here's the exposed problem, stated directly, without softening it, because softening it would defeat the entire point of looking at this loss honestly instead of just filing it away as a bad afternoon. Every win Eala collected this summer, Osaka, Svitolina, Pegula, Parks, Rus, came against opponents who, in different ways, gave her time inside points. That phrase, time inside points, deserves to be unpacked rather than treated as a throwaway line, because it's the actual mechanism explaining almost everything that happened in Cincinnati. Naomi Osaka, for all her power, still plays a game built around patterns and rhythm rather than pure early contact flattening. She gives an opponent enough look at the ball, enough predictability in shot selection, that a player with elite anticipation and movement can settle into rallies and start dictating terms after enough exchanges. Eala Cincinnati is fundamentally a grinder, a player whose entire career has been built on extending points, which is close to the best-case scenario imaginable for a counterpuncher like Eala, because it's two players speaking the same tactical language and seeing who executes it better over a longer sample of shots. Jessica Pegula, even as a former world number 3, plays controlled, consistent tennis rather than explosive, point-ending tennis, which is exactly why that Washington final swung the way it did. A dropped opening set, a grinding response, and eventually a 6-0 third set once Eala's patience wore Pegula's consistency down past its breaking point. Alicia Parks brings power, but inconsistent power, the kind that creates unforced error patterns a patient opponent can exploit by simply staying alive in points and waiting for the misses to accumulate. And Elena Gabriela Rus, whatever the history between them, never got the chance to establish any kind of rhythm at all before a foot injury and a lightning delay ended the match early. Every single one of those 5 matches, in other words, took place on ground where long rallies were possible, where multiple exchanges typically had to happen before a point resolved one way or the other. That's the terrain where Eala's counterpunching, her lateral movement, and her composure under extended pressure have thrived all month. Match after match, tournament after tournament, city after city. It's not a coincidence that built a 5-match run. It's a style advantage, repeated against 5 different opponents who each, for their own individual reasons, allowed that style room to operate. Anisimova doesn't play that kind of tennis, and this is the part that matters most, the part that turns one loss into a legitimate warning sign rather than a random blip. She ends points in 2 or 3 shots, flat and early off both wings, taking the ball on the rise rather than waiting for it to sit up into a comfortable strike zone. That's not a stylistic preference so much as a structural choice about where and when a point gets decided. A player like Anisimova isn't trying to out-rally an opponent. She's trying to make sure the rally never gets long enough to become a rally in the first place. For one set, remarkably, Eala's game held up against that anyway. She won the first set 6-4, finding enough depth, enough well-placed shots, enough composure under that different kind of pressure to make it look, for a little while, like her patient counterpunching could work against literally anyone regardless of how they like to play. That's genuinely significant on its own, and it says something real about her ceiling as a player, a 21-year-old, in her first ever meeting with a top 10 opponent playing a completely different style than anyone else she'd faced all month, still finding a way to win a set. That's not nothing. That's evidence of real adaptability, at least across the short term of a single set. Picture the anatomy of a typical Eala point during her summer run. Ball 1 is a neutral shot. Deep, safe, designed to do nothing except stay in play. Ball 2 is usually still neutral, maybe with a slight positional gain, a few extra inches of court taken back from whoever she's playing. It's not until ball 3 or 4 that real information starts to surface. How the opponent moves under sustained pressure, whether their backhand leaks under repeated depth, whether their footwork gets sloppy on the 4th or 5th change of direction, and it's usually not until ball 5 or 6 that the actual opening appears. The short ball that lands because a leg was a step slow, the angle that opens because a recovery step arrived a half beat late. That's the shot Eala actually wins the point on. Everything before it is infrastructure, not offense. This is why calling her a counterpuncher undersells what's really happening. She's not just reacting to what her opponent gives her, she's constructing a small war of attrition inside every single point, betting that her conditioning, her anticipation, and her movement will outlast whatever the opponent throws at her across 4, 5, 6 exchanges. Now walk through what Anisimova's game does to that structure, mechanically, shot by shot. Ball 1 from Anisimova often isn't neutral at all. It's already flat, already taken early, already hit with enough pace that it functions less like a starting point and more like a probe that's already testing for a mistake. Ball 2, if the point gets that far, usually carries the same characteristics. Minimal net clearance, minimal spin, minimal margin, hit from inside the baseline rather than behind it. That means the entire opening phase of the point, the phase Eala uses to gather information and set her positioning, gets compressed into roughly half the time and half the number of exchanges it normally takes. There's no ball 3 where Eala gets to read footwork patterns, because the point has often already resolved by ball 3, either with a winner, an error forced well before its usual arrival time, or a defensive shot so rushed it never had a chance to become the deep neutral ball her whole framework depends on. This is the part that gets missed when people just say, Anisimova hits harder. Raw pace alone doesn't break this framework. Eala has faced hard hitters all summer and absorbed their pace by getting more time through footwork, spin, and depth. What breaks the framework specifically is the combination of pace with early contact and flat trajectory, because that combination removes the two resources Eala's game plan is built around: time and shape. Time, because taking the ball early leaves less of a gap between when the ball leaves the opponent's racket and when Eala has to be in position and committed to her next shot. Shape, because a flat ball carries less spin-driven bounce variation, which means less opportunity to read trajectory early and adjust. The read has to happen almost entirely off contact point and racket angle, in a fraction of the time a bouncer, more arced ball would allow. So when the piece says the counter-punching had nowhere to hide, this is literally what that means on a point-by-point level. The fourth ball, the sixth ball, the eventual opening, none of it ever arrives, because the point simply doesn't survive long enough to reach the phase where Eala's tools are designed to operate. It's not that her legs got heavier in set 2, or that her decision-making got worse, or that her focus lapsed. It's that a tool built for 6-shot rallies has no mechanism for 2-shot rallies. You can be the best carpenter in the world with a chisel, but if someone hands you a task that only a saw can do, the chisel not working isn't a skill problem, it's a tool mismatch problem. That distinction matters enormously heading into New York, because fatigue gets solved with rest, scheduling, and recovery protocols. A tool mismatch problem gets solved with an entirely different kind of preparation: earlier contact points on her own return and neutral ball, more variation in spin and trajectory specifically engineered to slow an early contact hitter down, and pattern-based practice sets designed to simulate 2- and 3-shot point endings rather than the long exchanges she's been rewarded for reading well all summer. Those are two different training blocks, two different mental frameworks, and conflating them into one general "she needs to recover" narrative misses exactly what this specific loss actually revealed. That's the specific problem this loss exposes heading into the US Open, and it's worth being blunt about why it matters more at that specific tournament than it would almost anywhere else on the calendar. Hard courts at Flushing Meadows are full of exactly this kind of player: big servers, flat ball strikers, players who don't hand a counterpuncher the runway she needs to get comfortable. The US Open's hard courts play fast, the ball skids through low, and the tournament's draw, by pure numbers, includes more first-strike, power-based players than almost any other slam on the calendar. That's not a minor detail buried in playing conditions. It's close to the defining characteristic of that specific tournament's competitive environment. Anisimova was the first true test of that specific style all summer, the first opponent Eala faced whose entire game was built around denying rally length rather than incidentally shortening it. And for 2 sets out of 3, it beat her. Comment with an actual name, not a vague answer. Which seeded player in the US Open field plays closest to Anisimova's style? The one you'd genuinely worry about if Eala runs into her in the second week. I want specifics in that comment section, not just someone big or a power player. Name the player, and while you're doing that, think about seeding position too, because the further a name like that sits from Eala's own seed number, the later they'd realistically meet, and the more recovery time and tactical adjustment Eala would have had before running into that exact profile again. Let's actually sit inside that scoreline for a second, because 4-6, 6-4, 6-2 tells a very specific story if you know how to read it, and it's not the story of a player who got physically outclassed from the opening ball. Eala took that first set clean, 6-4, playing exactly the tennis that had carried her through 5 different ranked wins across 3 countries this summer. Deep returns, patient neutral balls, waiting for the window, and then hurting Anisimova once the rally opened up. That's not a fluke opening set against a top 10 player. That's a game plan executing on schedule. The problem is what happened in the 2 sets after it, because a 6-4, 6-2 collapse across sets 2 and 3 isn't a story about one bad service game or one unlucky net cord. It's a story about a plan that worked for exactly 1 set before the opponent adjusted, and once Anisimova adjusted, Eala didn't have an answer ready. Look at where the match actually turned. Service games won, 79% for Anisimova, 64% for Eala. A real gap, but not the gap that decided this. The number that decided this match is the return column, because Anisimova won 36% of Eala's service games as the returner, while Eala converted only 21% of Anisimova's. That's not a small edge. That's the difference between a returner who's occasionally getting into a rally and a returner who's genuinely pressuring second serves, stepping in, taking time away before the point even develops into the long exchanges Eala wants to live in. Once Anisimova started doing that in set 2, Eala's own service games stopped being safe holds and started being survival holds. And survival holds against a player who can end points in 2 or 3 shots off either wing are exactly the kind of holds that eventually crack. This is the part worth sitting with, because it's not really about talent, and it's definitely not about heart. Anyone who watched the Parks revenge match in Toronto 48 hours after barely landing from a title run in Washington already knows this is a player who competes. It's about a stylistic ceiling that hasn't been tested this directly before this week. Every win this summer, Osaka, Svitolina, Pegula, Parks, Roos, came against opponents who, for different reasons, let a point breathe. Osaka has raw power too, but she's had well-documented consistency lapses under sustained rally pressure. Svitolina is a grinder who wants long exchanges just as much as Eala does, which turns their matches into contests of patience rather than contests of who can deny patience altogether. Pegula plays a controlled positional game that rewards exactly the kind of footwork and anticipation Eala specializes in. Parks is talented but streaky, capable of engaging in exactly the kind of extended baseline battles where Eala's movement wins out over time. Roos, whatever her level that day, retired at 6-1, 3-0, never forcing Eala to solve anything at all. Anisimova is a different problem entirely, and it's worth being precise about why, because she hits hard, undersells it. The issue isn't raw pace. Plenty of players on tour hit hard. The issue is contact point and shot selection. Anisimova takes the ball early, flat, and close to the baseline on both wings, which removes the 2 things Eala's game depends on most: time to read the shot and a ball with enough shape or spin to redirect on her own terms. When a ball arrives late loaded with pace and no arc, a counterpuncher's first read has to happen faster than usual, and if that first read is off by even a fraction of a second, the whole defensive structure, the recovery step, the split, the next shot selection, starts arriving late too. That's what a 6-2 third set actually looks like from the inside. Not one big collapse, but a series of split seconds that kept arriving just late enough to turn neutral balls into defensive scrambles. Now here's why this matters so much more than a normal Week 3 loss at a WTA 1000 event would. This match is now permanently part of the file. Every coaching team scouting Eala between now and the US Open draw has this specific data point available. Patient, deep, rally-based tennis got dismantled once the pace and flatness increased past a certain threshold, and it happened over 2 full sets, not one unlucky game. That's not speculation anyone has to build from old tape or theoretical matchup analysis. It's fresh, it's from 3 weeks ago, and it's exactly the kind of thing an opposing coach highlights the night before a US Open second-round assignment. The question isn't whether this tape gets watched, it will be watched. The question is whether Eala's team watches it first. and whether they build something specific out of it before anyone else gets the chance to exploit it in New York. So what would actually fixing this look like, concretely, rather than just wishfully waiting for the problem to disappear on its own? It probably starts with contact point, not footwork. The ability to take her own return earlier, closer to the baseline, so that flat early hitters don't get the free rhythm-setting first strike they got for stretches of sets 2 and 3. It might mean deliberately mixing in more slice and heavier topspin on the ball she gives Anisimova-style hitters, specifically to reintroduce the kind of shape and bounce variation that disrupts a flat hitter's timing, rather than feeding pace into pace and hoping movement alone solves it. It could mean building specific patterns around the second serve return, since that's traditionally the highest value point in tennis for an aggressive returner, and Eala's numbers there, 38% won, show real room to close the gap with someone who's already proven she can push that number into the mid-40s. And there's a scheduling piece too, one that has nothing to do with technique. A title in Washington on August 3rd, a flight to Toronto within 48 hours, a grinding draw there, then straight into Cincinnati. That's 3 ranked tournaments back-to-back with almost no recovery window, and legs that are even 5% heavier by set 3 of a third match in 3 weeks are legs that arrive a fraction of a second later to every one of those splits that decide whether a flat early ball gets read in time. None of that is a guarantee. 2 weeks is a real amount of time for a tour-level team to make adjustments, but it's not a magic amount of time. It's enough to sharpen a pattern, not necessarily enough to rebuild a stylistic identity from scratch, and nobody watching this should pretend those are the same thing. What this loss actually did is turn an abstract theoretical question, how does Eala's game handle real first strike power, into a concrete, answered one, with a scoreline and a stat sheet attached. That's more valuable information than another comfortable win over a player who plays into her hands would have been, even though it obviously feels worse in the moment. So here's the actual comment section question, and I want a specific answer, not just a gut reaction. Does this loss make you more nervous about a specific type of US Open matchup than you were a week ago? And if so, name the type of player you're now worried about drawing her against. Not she'll be fine. That's not an answer, that's a hope. Not she's cooked either, because a 9-4 record against top to 10 opponents built over an entire season doesn't get erased by one 3-setter against a player who legitimately plays this way at her best. Somewhere in between those two reactions is where the real conversation is, and that's exactly where this loss leaves her heading into New York with 2 weeks left to prove which version of the fix actually gets built in time.